In terms of specific plans, the Civil War strategy for the North was called the Anaconda Plan. It was originally planned by Winfield Scott, who was a hero during the Mexican Revolution. His goal was to crush the Southern Rebellion using a naval blockade to shut out European supplies and exports, and then a campaign to take the Mississippi River and thereby split the South, and targeting cities of the South in hopes that pro-Unionists would rise up in the South and overthrow the secession movement. It would ultimately both the blockade and the taking of the Mississippi River were successful, so they strangled the South like an anaconda would strangle somebody. The Homestead Act granted 160 acres of government land to any person who would farm it for at least 5 years in order to help promote people moving out west. This free soil proposal became law when the Southern Democrats were not part of Congress. Congress, during the Civil War, because it was really controlled by just the Northern Republicans, was able to really do whatever it wanted. The Battle of Antietam was a Civil War battle that offered the North an opportunity to defeat General Lee and shorten the war. The Northern general was George McClellan, and he had received cigars that they had found that had the battle plans, but he didn't trust it. And so because he was really slow and hesitant to respond, he basically lost this battle. Lee's army was forced to retreat to Virginia after a bloody battle, but McClellan's failure to pursue Lee led Lincoln to remove him from command. So technically, even though the North was overly cautious, technically the North won the battle, but McClellan is going to lose because they weren't able to capture Lee, just defeat him temporarily. So it was more of a draw than anything, I argue, anyways. The Emancipation Proclamation was issued by Lincoln, and it said that all frees in rebellious states were freed, and that if they made it to the army, they could join the army. If they made it to the Union Army, they could join in the Union Army and fight for others as independents. And this is going to lead a lot of slaves in the South to leave their plantations. It's also going to increase morale in the North because you do have a huge influx in terms of more soldiers to fight. It was partially designed to keep England from joining the war on the side of the South. It was kind of like a bribe, like, oh, we'll free our slaves. Now you'll like us, right, England? Cool, come help out the Union. It doesn't really work that much on that side, though. And the biggest thing is the Emancipation Proclamation changes the perception of the war from a conflict about preserving the Union to a conflict about ending slavery. Battle of Gettysburg. Lee invaded Pennsylvania from Virginia and was pursued by Northern General Meade. Lee was defeated and retreated to Virginia. It's the bloodiest, most decisive battle of the Civil War, but remember, it's spread over several days, and it's the farthest northern advance of the Confederacy. There were boats that were used as well. There were some naval battles. The most famous would be the Battle of the Monitor versus the Merrimack, which were old Ironsides. The Confederates had the Merrimack, and the Union had the Monitor. And really, it's impossible to say who really won because they're both just wooden boats slamming into each other. Lincoln had started coming up with a 10% plan pretty early into the war, and that this was how he thought the Union could be restored quickly and easily with malice towards none and charity for all. His 10% plan allowed Southerners, excluding the highest-ranking Confederate officers and military leaders, to take an oath promising future loyalty to the Union and to end slavery. When 10% of those who had registered to vote in 1860 took that oath, a state could ask to be readmitted. This plan was not accepted by Congress mainly because he was killed before he could push it through. Sherman's March to the Sea. General William Tecumseh Sherman led Union troops through Georgia and burned everything as he went, waging what he called total war in an effort to break the will to fight. He captured and burned Atlanta in September of 1864, and this is going to destroy Atlanta as well as lower Southern morale and diminish supplies. He's then going to burn everything from Atlanta to Savannah and go on to North and South Carolina. In the middle of the Great Civil War, Lincoln has to run for re-election in 1864. He's going to run against the General McClellan, who claimed that the war was a failure, but said that it was a failure because of Lincoln, not because of, his own indecisiveness or his own Napoleon complex, whatever you want to call it. Lincoln ran on the ticket of national unity with Andrew Johnson, a loyalist from Tennessee. Sherman's taking of Atlanta helped Lincoln win the election, and then those sympathetic to the Southern cause were called Copperheads because they were dangerous like a snake. The Wade Davis bill was a proposal to reunite the country that was put forth by Senators Wade and Davis, and this required that instead of 10% of the state's voters taking a loyalty oath, they wanted 50%. This demanded stronger efforts on behalf of states to emancipate slaves as well. Lincoln is going to pocket veto the bill in favor of his own 10% plan. Pocket veto just means he's going to kind of ignore it until the bill expires. At the conclusion of the Civil War, Lee wound up having to surrender. He knew he couldn't win anymore. And remember, this is the great Virginian who was originally offered the head of the Union, but because he viewed himself as a Virginian first, he goes and fights with the South. But ultimately, he is going to surrender to General Grant at Appomattox Courthouse in Virginia. Should be 2 E's. Lee's surrender caused the remaining Confederate soldiers to lay down their arms, not like literally like their arms, but like their guns. And by the end of the conflict, the country had sustained over 600,000 casualties, being the deadliest war in American history. The period after the Civil War is when we have to try to repair everything that goes wrong, and this is called Reconstruction. The U.S. tried to transform the organization and society of former Confederate states. Reconstruction's first goal was to determine how the South would take over its own governance, because at the time we had the military down there. And they basically had to say, like, what do we have to do, like, what's going to be the punishment for these southern states, and what's the process for them reapplying for statehood. In 1867, Congress put the South under the Army's control to oversee elections, ensure the rights of freed slaves, and restrict Confederate leaders from gaining power. The new Republican state governments formed a variety of Reconstruction programs, but former Confederates, suspicious of these efforts, claimed corruption within state leadership, and some turned to violent opposition. Reconstruction concluded with the Compromise of 1877, which is the election of Hayes, and the end of federal control in the South. Former Confederate states began enacting the Jim Crow laws and disenfranchising many African Americans. So while they changed some of the laws, they never changed the will. And so once the North has released its hold on the South kind of goes back to the old ways, just looking differently. The Freedmen's Bureau was this agency that was created by Congress that was supposed to go down to the South and basically help the newly, quote, freedmen. They needed to provide food, clothing, and education for the freed slaves because these were people who historically didn't have any money, didn't have clothes, didn't have education, and the only job training they had were in farms. Ex-slave states were divided into districts that were managed by assistant commissioners. Despite its benefit, the Bureau failed to establish the freed slaves as landowners, which was its primary goal. However, it did organize the African American vote for the Republican Party, creating great animosity towards the Bureau in the South. Radical Republicans were a faction of the Republican Party that believed the Civil War was meant to stop slavery and emancipate all slaves. It believed Congress should control Reconstruction, not the presidency. It rejected the reentry of Tennessee, Arkansas, and Louisiana into the Union despite their qualifications under the 10% plan. They wanted the rebellious South to be dealt with in a harsher manner, and then Wade, again from Wade Davis, and then Thaddeus Stevens were among their main members. However, they are effective in terms of getting 3 major amendments passed to the Constitution. These are the Reconstruction Amendments. 13 is what abolishes slavery. 14 says the freed slaves are now citizens, and 15 says because they're citizens, they can vote. And that's the way to remember it. You're free, so you're a citizen, so you can vote. Black codes were restrictions by southern states on former slaves, designed to replicate the conditions of slavery. These were like slave codes, but now they're black codes. Various codes prohibited meetings without a white person present, while others also established segregated public facilities, which is going to maintain, is going to be considered constitutional until 1954. This is going to lead to radical Republican opposition and exclusion of Southern representation in Congress. Jim Crow laws are these laws that separate whites and African Americans in public facilities. So everything from bathrooms to diners to like trains, you name it. Anything public was separated. Black facility, white facility. And very often the black facilities were of lower quality. Although Plessy v. Ferguson is going to be the Supreme Court case that says, oh no, separate but equal. But no one really enforced the equal side of that. This is going to prove the limits of the 14th Amendment. So it's like, oh, well, they're citizens? Yeah, but kind of. And the name of the laws are said to be derived from a character in an old minstrel song. Booker T. Washington was the son of a slave and a slave woman and a white man. He taught at Hampton Institute, and in 1881 he helped organize a school specifically for African Americans. It's called an HBC, Historically Black College, in Tuskegee, Alabama. The Tuskegee Institute emphasized industrial training to help African Americans gather wealth and become influential in society. So basically, he was giving them job training. It claimed that it was a mistake for African Americans to push for social equality before they become economically equal. His ideas were denounced by some leaders in the African American community. However, he becomes very influential as a lecturer, as well as writing a book called Up from Slavery. When Lincoln is assassinated, he is replaced by his vice president, Andrew Johnson, who becomes the 17th president. He initially followed Lincoln's policies that Lincoln had outlined, but gradually became more and more conservative, giving amnesty to former Confederate officials and opposing legislation that dealt with former slaves. His veto of the Civil Rights Act was overridden by Congress. He really just didn't get along with Congress at all. His opposition to the radical Republicans, as well as his violation of the Tenure of Office Act, led to his impeachment by the House, but he was one vote short of being impeached by the Senate. Remember, impeach just means bring charges against. Seward's folly, we bought Alaska. Secretary of State William Seward decided to buy Alaska for $7.2 million from Russia. Congress agreed to the purchase as Russia had been pro-North during the Civil War. So they're like, okay, well, they liked us, so we'll like them. Most members thought that the purchase was ridiculous, that the land was useless. But obviously there's a gold rush later on, and then today we know there's oil, so guess we were right in the first place. Carpetbaggers and scalawags. Carpetbaggers was a derogatory Southern name for Northerners who came to the South to participate in Reconstruction governments, and it was because they packed their stuff in these carpet bags. Scalawags was the derogatory name for Southerners working for or supporting the federal government during Reconstruction. So scalawags are Southerners, carpetbaggers are Northerners who move south. Some of these Southerners had opposed the war from the beginning, while others helped Reconstruction for financial gain. Partially in response to Reconstruction, a group of Southern whites formed the KKK, which targeted carpetbaggers, scalawags, African Americans, and others with aggressive, sometimes violent acts. Ulysses S. Grant becomes the 18th president, running on they said, waving the bloody shirt, like he's the hero from all these other wars. He himself was kind of an ineffective president, nice guy, but had corrupt people around him, and unfortunately he takes the blame for a lot of their corrupt actions. Some of these guys are going to do scandals like the Credit Mobilier and the whiskey scandal. The Credit Mobilier scandal was basically that there were stockholders of the Union Pacific Railroad who created a dummy company called Credit Mobilier. The company was supposed to complete the Transcontinental Railroad, but instead it stole millions of dollars from the government, and the blame for the scandal fell on Grant. The First Continental Railroad was finally completed during this time, though, with a golden spike at Promontory Point, Utah. It marked the beginning of the Union Pacific and the Central Pacific Railroads. During construction, the Union Pacific used Irish labor, while the Central Pacific used Chinese labor. And so not only did it mean like the country was united, but now you had races being united. Yay! Boo! Knights of Labor. Militant organizations seeking solution to labor problems. They allowed skilled and unskilled workers, along with women and African Americans, though, so that's good, to join. They wanted an 8-hour workday, termination of child labor, equal pay for equal work, and the elimination of private banks. That's all good. But they're very violent about how they go about these goals. Under Terence Powderly's leadership, the Knights reached membership of over 700,000, but its downfall was caused by the emergence of the AFL, mismanagement, and financial losses from unsuccessful strikes. There was a great economic depression in 1873 during Grant's second term, caused by overexpansive, unregulated businesses during the post-Civil War years, the failure of American investment banking firms, and economic downturns in Europe. It led to the retirement of greenbacks and a return to the gold standard. The whiskey ring was another of Grant's administration scandals. This was liquor taxes were increased to aid in paying off the cost of the Civil War. Distillers and Treasury officials conspired to defraud the government by giving out cheap tax stamps, robbing the government of millions in excise tax. Mark Twain, whose real name was Samuel Langhorne Clemens, was an American novelist who grew up in Hannibal, Missouri, and he's most famous for writing books like The Adventures of Tom Sawyer and Huckleberry Finn. But basically, his main contribution was that he was a satirist who was making commentary about American society, particularly along the Great Plains and the Mississippi River, and he also used distinctly accurate vernacular, which in future times, like today times, some people find obviously controversial.